What are the deadliest injuries? What causes us to die many years before we should? Well, on the surface, the answer to this question seems really clear. As you drove to this lecture, your car was filled with devices to prevent physical injuries. You buckled up a seatbelt. You looked through safety glass to steer. You pressed on an anti-lock brake. And airbags were ready to deploy in 25 milliseconds to cushion and protect you in case of an accident. And yet, if there was any accident at all, ambulances were standing by to rush you off to the hospital, where there was highly skilled surgeons and amazing technology like MRI machines and CAT scans to patch you back up. But what if we're wrong about the danger of physical injuries? What if we're looking at the smallest part of the problem rather than the largest? There actually is a whole other group of injuries. They're almost completely ignored in our society. They don't even have their own classification system. And yet, the research is rapidly piling up that they have a massive impact on our lives, on whether we die early or we live long, hearty lives. And chances are very good that you, just like I, have one or more of them. I'm talking about psychological injuries. There's 4 major types of psychological injuries. The first is trauma in childhood. The second is having a toxic workplace, toxic boss. The third is highly stressful life events, such as being divorced or having your business partner destroy your company on you. And the final is traumatic events in adulthood, such as being assaulted or a major car crash. Much of the research has focused on adverse childhood experiences. In these studies, the researchers asked people if they were physically, sexually, or emotionally abused before the age of 18. They were also asked if they were physically or emotionally neglected by their parents. They were asked if they had a parent with a serious mental disorder, substance abuse problem, a criminal record, if there was violence between the parents, or if they were separated from a parent before the age of 18 due to divorce or death. You might be adding these up in your mind, and a shiver of fear might be going down your neck. They're actually remarkably common, with research showing that 2/3 of the population has one or more of them. 2/3. I have one, and it's very likely that you have one or more. And if you don't, it is guaranteed that your spouse or your best friend has one or more. This affects us all. But how? How does it shape us that a parent died early, or that mom was relentlessly critical and put us down, or that somebody violated our sexual boundaries early in life? Isn't that in the past? Shouldn't we move on, get over it? If only it were that easy. It isn't. One study looked at refugees who had fled the Middle East. And these people had had bombs dropped on their homes. They'd been raped. They'd seen their siblings shot. Terrible pain. And when the researchers looked at their DNA, they found that there was as many breaks in their DNA as people who'd been exposed to an atomic bomb. Carrying that weight of emotional pain literally rips and fractures our DNA. And when DNA is torn and mutated like that, one of the results is cancer. Here we see the risk of cancer among people who had no childhood traumas, and their risk of cancer is set at 1. However, for the people who had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, their risk of cancer was 2.5 times greater than those with none. This isn't just a graph. This is a picture of my family. You see, my mother grew up in Holland during the Second World War. By the time she was 18, she had experienced 4 major traumas. And all that stress and fear and shame took a huge toll on her body. Her cells mutated wildly. she developed cancer, and she died at the age of 53. Her risk was 2.5 times greater, and it showed. But it's not just cancer, it's heart disease as well. Here we see that with every additional childhood trauma, the risk goes up, 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 until the people at the highest psychological risk have 310% greater risk of heart disease than people who grew up in an emotionally healthy home. This actually dwarfs the influence of genetics. Researchers at Harvard, they looked at all these genetic variants, and they found that the people with the highest genetic risk were 60% more likely to develop heart disease than those at the lowest. But the people at the highest psychological risk were 310% more likely to have heart disease. It's the same story for diabetes. There's a tripling of risk among people with multiple childhood traumas. Stroke is even worse, 6 times higher risk among people with multiple childhood traumas. It's the same story for cardio-obstructive pulmonary disease, 3.5 times greater risk. Liver and digestive diseases, 2.5 times greater risk. The worst of all, suicide. Here we see that the people that grew up in an emotionally healthy environment, only 1% of them attempted suicide by their mid-50s. But having just one childhood trauma doubled that risk. 2 traumas, doubled it again. 3 traumas, again and again and again, until the poor people who had 7 or more childhood traumas were 36 times more likely to attempt suicide than those who had none. 36 times. If this sounds grim, it is. Of the 10 leading causes of early death in this country, 7 of them are heavily influenced by psychological injuries. You can read them in the boldface: cancer, heart disease, stroke, COPD, diabetes, suicide, kidney disease. Physical injuries, they only show up once on that list under the category of accidents. So now we know. Now we understand that psychological injuries are the deadliest of them all. They cripple our bodies. They hit us with terrible diseases. They take decades off of our lives. Physical injuries, they are the least of our worries. I mean, sure, shattered femurs and punctured lungs, they do need to be treated. But they're only one of the 10 causes of early death. So what do we do now? What's the next step? How can you and I live long, healthy lives, knowing that the psychological injuries that we've experienced are shortening them? Well, the first step is to acknowledge them, to say, yes, I have a psychological injury. This is a lot harder to do than it seems, because our first reaction is to conceal them out of shame. And because we don't acknowledge them, we don't assess them. Because we don't assess them, we don't treat them. Because we don't treat them, we die far earlier than we need to. But why? Why don't we say we have a psychological injury with the same nonchalance as when we say, I broke my leg? The answer presents itself in my office every single week. Every week, a brand new client comes in. They wake up at 4 a.m, shivering with fear. They are so depressed, they want to die. And when I say, hey, what's going on in your life? They say, it's my boss. And they tell me of managers who lie to them, who say, your work is a 2 out of 10, who bully and backstab them. And then it happens. Every single time it happens. 100% of the time for the last 20 years, it happens. As they sit there sobbing and shaking and tears coming down their cheeks, they say, I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't feel this way. Do you hear the shame, the false guilt in that statement? I shouldn't feel this way. I am weak. I should be able to handle it. And yet, reporting to a bully for a boss is a serious psychological injury. It increases your risk of heart attack by 55%. That's as much as the highest genetic risk. A number of years ago, I had a client come in, and they were Employee of the Year for a multi-billion-dollar company. And his previous boss was great, really supportive, really trustworthy. And then he got transferred to a new toxic boss. And within 10 weeks of reporting to this new boss, he came into my office and he says, I'm going into the woods with a weapon and I'm not coming out. And then he said it. Just like every single person before him said it. He said, I shouldn't feel this way. I should be able to handle it. Well, he's just reflecting back what our culture had taught him. You see, there's a very strong message in our culture that emotional pain is a sign of weakness, that it is invalid. Get over it. But the truth is completely different. He wasn't weak. He was Employee of the Year for a multi-billion-dollar company, for crying out loud. No, he wasn't weak. He was psychologically injured by his toxic boss. You're not weak either. If you carry psychological injuries from an abusive parent, or someone who violated your boundaries early on in life, you're not weak. It takes tremendous energy and strength to carry that boulder of emotional pain through your life. If at times you slide into depression or you're startled with anxiety, you're not weak. You're psychologically injured. You didn't choose this for yourself. You didn't sign up for it. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Someone else inflicted it on you. The hypercritical mother, the bullying boss, they put a psychological injury on you without your consent, without your agreement or understanding. So, acknowledge your psychological injuries without any shame. And once you acknowledge them, then you can assess them. You can map them out. You can download the Psychological Injury Index to help you with that process of starting your understanding. And once you've filled in the Psychological Injury Index, then you can seek treatment. And the best way to heal a psychological injury is through psychotherapy. Because people heal people. Pills, they numb some of the emotion for a while, but at the end of the day, people heal people. I mean, it's true. Some people hurt people, and it's very likely that your psychological injury was put on you by another person. But ultimately, people heal people. That's the healing that goes really deep, right to the core. So, seek out a qualified therapist, preferably one who measures in every session if you're getting better and your sense of teamwork with them. Because that's the single most important factor, that healing connection with another person. Try a few therapists. See which one you have a good sense of teamwork with, whether they're helping you achieve your goals, whether their approach is a good fit for you. And the healing goes very deep indeed. That's the great point of hope for all of us who have psychological injuries and want to live long, healthy lives. Remember the DNAs, the refugees with the broken DNA? when their post-traumatic stress disorder was successfully treated with psychotherapy, their DNA became as healthy as people who had never experienced any trauma. Therapy healed them right down to their DNA, every single cell of their body. So, if the healing of psychological injuries can calm the terrors of post-traumatic stress disorder and knit together our DNA to be as good as new again, then there's hope for all of us, body and soul, regardless of our past. Thank you.